So I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'm Jennifer March, Executive Director of CCC and Chair of the IBO Board. Before we get started, since there are a lot of new faces, I thought it would be great to go around the room and then we can call out people on the screen to introduce themselves. I'm going to start, Brian, down at the end with you.
Great. Hi, I'm Brian Cain. I'm the Budget Review Analyst at IBO. I started back in August.
I'm Sarah Stefanski. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing, Environment, and Infrastructure team.
I'm Sarita Subramanian. I'm Assistant Director for Education.
We're going to skip Louisa till the end.
Arjun Armbruster. I'm the Analyst for Art, Global Affairs, and the Legal System.
Hi, I'm Gordon Tate. I'm in the third team at the IBO.
Hi, I'm Julia Conrad, and I'm Assistant
Hi, my name is Eric Closure. I am an economist that started in.
Hi, I'm Jacob Berman. I'm the Assistant Director of Social Community Services.
Michael Jacobs, Assistant Director for Economics and Taxes.
Logan Clark, Assistant Director for Budget Review.
Crystal Olson, Deputy Comptroller for Budget from the Comptroller's Office.
Mark Page, board member.
Tara Swanson. I'm the Production Coordinator for Digital and Print.
Elizabeth Brown, Director. Lisa Mary, Chief of Staff.
Tanya Guarda. I'm an Education Budget Policy Analyst.
Great. So I'm going to call out Tony.
Hey, Tony Shores, board member.
Emily.
I'm Emily Pramick, Transportation Analyst at IBO.
Francesco.
Hi, Francesco, New York City Executive Deputy Comptroller.
Jonathan. On you. Jonathan Rosenberg is from Counsel Finance. Wayne.
Hi, Wayne Ho, IBO board member.
And Jackie.
Jackie Sherman, IBO General Counsel.
Thank you. So I think we're also waiting for Hutson should join us shortly. I'm going to first approve the minutes, Lisa, before we talk about you. So can I have a motion to approve the minutes of December 9th, 2022?
Move.
Mark Page, and second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. So I want to welcome Louisa Chafee to her first IBO board meeting. She was officially appointed, I guess your first day was March 1st. So welcome. You've been on the job about a minute. We appreciate the shoes you're filling. We have great respect for Ronnie Lowenstein and George Sweeting. And for those of you that don't know, Louisa will say a little bit about herself, but she has many years experience in city and state government and the nonprofit sector. So welcome, Louisa. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself before I talk about other things?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. It's an honor and a delight to be here with all of you and with the advisory committee. Thank you. I joined IBO March 1 after 7 years in the nonprofit sector and in the philanthropy. And prior to that, about over 15 years in government, a combination of city and state government experience. And so I'm honored to be working with the economists. I'm not an economist, but I know many other parts of government and the general functioning. And I'm looking forward to building on the excellence of IBO and seeing where 2023 will take us as we think about new opportunities in a challenging budget environment.
Thank you. So there are a couple things I want to address before we turn it over to facilitate a conversation around new analysis. So the first is, since the last advisory board meeting, we've lost 3 advisory board members, Mark Canizero and Frank Whitcuss to retirement, and Bob Megna, as you know, has stepped up to be the state budget director. We're tremendously grateful for the 3 of them for their service to the advisory board over the past several years, and especially for their work on the director search this past year. Sadly, Tony Shores' term ended. It ends at the end of March. So Tony, we want to thank you for your service to the advisory board as well and your work on the search. All in all, as of the end of the month, the advisory board will have 5 vacancies to fill, and filling these vacancies is a priority. And we will be working directly with the city controller office and the public advocate office to come up with a docket of candidates to get into these positions really very soon. So I'm going to turn it over to Louisa, who I think is going to facilitate the updates.
Yes, I think I already did my general remark.
Yes, sorry.
How's
How's that order?
I can repeat that. So I thought it would be really great if we had a presentation to the advisory board of recent work done by the people who did that. So I think we're starting with the preliminary budget, and that will be Michael and Logan.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Start very briefly. First, we have a forecast, work with a forecast of the U.S. economy that is premised on economic growth slowing greatly this year in the near term, but the economy not falling into recession. Of course, this is a very risky forecast given the Federal Reserve's efforts to fight inflation. There's an inflation report coming out today. I was not on any website that I saw 5 minutes ago, so I don't have anything to say about that. But we're forecasting 1.3% real GDP growth this year, followed by, and with a few quarters having minimal or no growth at all, followed by modest growth, about 2.5% on average. The greatest risk, of course, comes from the Federal Reserve raising interest rates too fast or too much in its effort to fight inflation, and that's become more into focus with the recent banking problems that we've had. Regarding the New York City economy, the trajectory largely follows the national economy. We have some good news finally, where the recovery of jobs lost during the pandemic, while it's been lagging behind the nation at large, recent months it's been exceeding expectations, and we exceeded our forecast of an increase of 212,000 jobs in calendar year 2022. The city has now recovered about 98% of the jobs lost due to COVID, and we predict it will reach that 100% mark sometime in middle of 2024. What's interesting about, but we're forecasting slow job growth or little job growth, or modest, I think it's the best word, modest job growth in 2023 of about 46,000, with some sort of rebound in 2024, and then modest growth thereafter. What's interesting lately is the number of jobs in leisure and hospitality has finally taken off. This is one of the industries that was most affected by the downturn due to COVID. It's picked up partly because of tourism, but actually the real growth has been in restaurants and bars, employment in restaurants and bars, not also in hotels, but really in restaurant and bars. So let's drink to that. Then the other thing to note is employment growth in information, which is one of the first industries to recover, has weakened, and with all the stuff going on in social media, we're watching that carefully. And finally, the increase in interest rates is taking a bite out of financial firms' profits, Wall Street profits, and that's factored into our forecast. So last year, let's turn to revenue now. Last year, tax revenue increased by about 6.2% as this is last fiscal year that ended June 30th, 2022. tax increase was 6.2% in the fiscal year. We're anticipating slower growth this year and next. For 2023, tax revenue growth is about 1.7%, followed by actually a decline in fiscal year 2024, full decline of 1.3%. Collections of many taxes have come in stronger than we expected, particularly the business income taxes, sales tax, and hotel occupancy tax. And the declines in the mortgage reporting tax due to higher interest rates has not been as steep. But for next year, for fiscal year 2024, we forecast large declines in business tax revenue and personal income tax revenue, little growth in property tax revenue, and collections of real estate taxes, yielding the 1.3% decline, total decline. Average growth after 2024 is 3.8%, and that's lower than the average growth in the years preceding COVID. And that's, just in comparison to OMB, our forecast is significantly higher than OMB's this year, by 2.5%. However, it's lower than OMB next year, and that's unusual for an IBO forecast. And then we become higher again in the out years. Our forecast is generally higher than OMB's due to business income tax, real estate related taxes, the commercial rent tax, the mortgage reporting tax, and the real property transfer tax. And anyone has questions, they can see me later, or I don't want to take up time in the meeting, or
People have questions. Any questions?
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, and then on the expense side, I think one of the key dynamics that really sort of emerged from this particular plan is the truism that budgets are always just a snapshot in time. We released a budget on February 9th, or our forecast budget on February 9th. And shortly thereafter, we saw the announcement of the DC 37 labor negotiations. So that really threw a whole monkey wrench into our numbers that we had just released. And so our staff in the past month has really done a substantial amount of work to update those numbers going forward. So that's something that we're really proud of here. Broadly speaking, at the time that we released the report, we were looking at about 104.7 billion in total expenditures for FY23. Given Michael's revenue increases, that was looking like about a $2.8 billion surplus. That effectively has been zeroed out for the current year with the impact of the labor negotiations. And Brian will go into those momentarily. But I do want to highlight a couple of the repricing differences that we've made since our last plan, which I think are really exciting. For the first time, we did a citywide personal services repricing, which Brian had worked on. This was something that was really substantial, and we're starting to fine tune that model as we go forward. But we're ideally looking at having essentially a PS projection for the entire city on a going forward basis, which is really exciting news. That's something that, we're talking about teams and teams of people doing over at OMB, and we're trying to really sort of pare that down and sort of automate a lot of that work. So that's something that's really exciting. Sarita's team just started putting in Carter case settlements into the out years. For those of you who don't know, the Carter cases are effectively a settlement wherein the city provides reimbursement to parents who feel that their students aren't receiving a proper education in the city of New York, in the DOE. And that goes to generally the special education programs, religious schools at certain times. And those settlements have just drastically increased in their total output. The number of parents requesting them has been increasing. The caseload is enormous. They just created an entirely new division over at Oath to deal with this. So something that is really exploding. Sarita's team did a great job in forecasting those. And so that's something that's in here. The other sort of big story of the day, obviously, is asylum seekers. Sarah and Jacob and Claire did fantastic work on really sort of delving into those populations, looking at the population growth, and then also sort of backing out the federal side versus what's covered by the state. And so we feel really comfortable with those numbers, but it's obviously an evolving situation. Like I said, budgets are always snapshots, so that's something that's sort of ever shifting sands. And with that, I think I'll probably pass it over to Brian, who's going to explain how we went from a $2.8 billion current year surplus to about 318.
Yeah. So, yeah. So there are basically two tenets of our estimates that are related to labor. And the first is what Logan was mentioning, our personal services model. We use actual data from the first 6 months of the year and historical patterns to project how much we would actually spend on non-uniform agencies' PS costs in 2023. And we estimated about $1.7 billion less than OMB. That's primarily due to the fact that OMB uses budgeted headcount and we use actuals, and there's a bit of a gap between the two of them at the moment because of COVID-related attrition. Uniform agencies, relatedly, we actually estimate $300 million more in spending, and that's primarily due to overtime. Therefore, at prelim, we did have a budget surplus and we were estimating a net savings on labor, but we identified the largest risks to that would be the labor contract settlements. And a few weeks after that, DC 37 struck a tentative agreement with the city. And if that pattern is followed by all of the other unions, then we have estimated the total PS costs in 2023 would be about $2.5 billion. And that is about 16 to 17 billion in the entire planned window through 2027. There's a lot of open questions related to this estimate, such as which year each of the other unions will settle their agreements, whether there will be other terms for uniforms or for non-remote workers, for example. And so those estimates could shift. But overall, our PS savings that we had projected are less than the labor contract costs overall.
And I do actually have a couple more shout outs that I just remembered as Brian was talking. Arden, Jordan, and he's not here today, but Bernie did really great work on the uniform side of the PS model. One of the things that, for those of you, you're a very learned group in here, the uniformed agencies operate drastically differently from the rest of the city. And so it's really important to sort of deal with seasonality and the issues surrounding that. So Jordan was working on DSNY, Arden was working on DOC, and then Bernie handled FDNY and NYPD. And so I just wanted to make sure that their hard work was recognized as well.
And is NYCHA and health and hospitals included in your estimate?
Yes.
And you know where the UFC is and their?
We don't right now. That's something that's a bit of an open question. One of the things that we've effectively come to the conclusion is that it's better not to try and figure out what's going on at the negotiation table. We've gamed out a few scenarios, but I don't think that we're really sort of comfortable saying what's going to be happening with those negotiations. One of the things that we are doing is we're working on pricing out in various increments. And for a 0.25% increase, what does that look like going forward? And so that's sort of providing information and numbers as these things come out, but we're not trying to look into that black box of those negotiations.
Any questions on the labor? Oh, good morning. Any questions on the labor negotiation pricing? Everyone's not surprised. You do that last week. Okay.
It's a very tight fiscal year.
It's gone from being somewhere where it's a little bit more open to being a lot tighter. We still have reserves. That's the total sort of non-budgeted reserves have remained unchanged since the last plan. So that's something to be looking forward to. It's about 8.6 billion that we've got stored away in either the retiree health benefits trust, the rainy day fund, or the general reserve.
So before you turn to your next presentation, Karim, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Karim Hutson, IBO advisory member. I'm also the president CEO of Genesis Companies, which does affordable housing in the city.
Thanks, Karim. And Elena, I think you just joined also, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Elena. Sorry for being about 5 minutes late there at the beginning, but I'm on Sarah Stefanski's team. So I cover the city's small business services department. I cover Department of City Planning, as well as consumer and worker protection. And then within SBS, I also kind of do research on EDC, so the city's economic development corporation and other development agencies that we have that are outside the city as well. So yeah, thanks for having us at this meeting. It's exciting.
Thank you.
Hey, I just wanted to let you know that unfortunately I'm in the airport, so I'm going to be moving around, so I will turn off my video, but I'll try to listen as long as I can.
Thank you.
And then I have a question on the DC 37 agreement. So the agreement, to my understanding, is for municipal workers, and a lot of folks in the contracted nonprofit childcare world were initially assuming, because of the news coming out of DC 37, that it would cover them too. And then now it's not. Does IBO have numbers on what the cost would be if there was a comparable agreement for the nonprofit childcare side?
That's actually something that we're working on right now. We've been in contact with a couple of other nonprofits. One of the things that, obviously the big thing there is, what do the labor numbers look like, and what are the affected populations? So that's something that we're actually getting information on right now, and we'll be probably releasing something at some point in time within the future, just regarding what that looks like.
I think, Wayne, I don't know if you mean this, but there are unionized workers within the sector, and the first phase of parity addressed both the certified teachers who were DC 37 members and those that were not. And so the question of parity is larger than whether or not you're a union member in the contract space.
Yeah.
Yep, no, that's correct. Thank you, Jen.
So if there are no more questions, next up we have Sarah, who's going to talk about recent testimony and maybe also related things.
Good morning, everyone. As Lisa just mentioned, this is something that IBO recently testified on at a state Senate hearing.
I don't say this right. I'm sorry. On the MTA budget and Penn Station revitalization plan. Sorry.
Yes. So we had a state Senate hearing here in the city about 2 weeks ago on the very large and broad topics of the MTA's budget, ridership, and the Penn Station redevelopment project. So I'm just going to touch upon a few things. When the state executive budget came out, it had a lot of implications for the MTA that were tied to the city's budget. So as you may have noticed, ridership is back, but not at pre-pandemic levels. We're about 70% of where we were before the pandemic on ridership. And the MTA is facing an annual budget deficit of around 600 million this year, and then this is growing to 1.2 billion next year, and even further out. And so notably, these deficits are even after the MTA has used $4.4 billion in federal COVID aid, after fare and toll increases of nearly 6%. And then it also includes a planned $400 million per year in MTA operational savings, but they have yet to identify where those savings are coming from. So these gaps could be even larger if, first off, the savings don't materialize that they've built into the budget. And also, the authority has built into their budget an assumption of inflation and wage settlements pegged at 2% over the next 3 years. And whether that's realistic or not is a very open-ended question. So to close these gaps, the governor's executive budget has state contributions and city contributions. So the state is going to give, at least in this proposal, $300 million in one-time aid. And also they're planning to increase the rate for the payroll mobility tax. And this is a tax paid across the MTA service area. So New York City, up the Hudson, and also Long Island. The state is also including anticipated casino revenues and taxes, but what's notable about this is that none of these revenues related to casinos, which haven't even been authorized and licensed yet, won't appear during the current MTA's budget plan. They're so far out. So that seems a little bit silly, but very, very off in the future. And then New York City is being asked to contribute to the tune of around $500 million annually in 3 new buckets of revenue sources. So the first one is paratransit. The state executive budget is looking for the city to pay 100% of paratransit costs instead of our 50% that we had been paying. This is the largest of these 3 state budget proposals that hit the city's budget. And it's worth noting that paratransit is one area of the MTA that is almost nearly at pre-pandemic levels. We're at 90% of usership, and it's expected to continue to grow. We have an aging population, and we see growth in the paratransit area of the MTA's budget. Secondly, they want the city to pay for 100% of student Metro card fares, net sort of any eligible state subsidies. So right now the city pays a flat rate of $47 million annually towards student Metro cards, and this would push the entire cost onto the city. This is hard to predict because it's tied to enrollment and then student usage. And so this is also an area that could fluctuate and is sort of hard to budget year to year. And then the third proposal is the payroll tax offset payments. This is kind of a wonky corner of the state and MTA, but for this payroll mobility tax, and in various iterations of revising the tax, they've carved out exemptions. So the largest ones are K through 12 schools are exempt from paying it, and library systems, public library systems. And in order to make up for those lost revenues created by those exemptions, the state gives a block amount of money to the MTA known as the payroll offset. And they are looking for New York City to cover a larger part of this payroll offset. So they're asking the city to pay 47%. And in addition, the increased rate for the payroll mobility tax is hitting the top tier of employers, so employers with the largest payrolls. New York City is one of those employers. So that rate increase will add about $50 million to the city just by virtue of having lots of employees. So these are 3 things that Governor Hochul has announced. They will obviously be debated as Albany continues to do its process. So how this shakes out is still in play. But as Logan and Brian mentioned, with labor settlements, a lot of the city's sort of budget cushion that IBO had been anticipating is being carved out. It's already being sort of claimed. And so that makes any sort of budget changes related to the MTA, they hurt more. So that's definitely something we're keeping an eye on as Albany continues to do their budget negotiations. And these 3 areas are things that are either hard to predict what the budget will be or that there is anticipated growth in the cost over time. And I think it's probably not an accident that those were selected for the city to take responsibility for. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. This hearing also touched upon the Penn Station Area Civic Land Use Improvement Plan, or the Penn Station Redevelopment Project. And this is something that IBO evaluated last year, leading up to the vote for the general project plan. There's near universal agreement that Penn Station needs improvements. Anyone who's ridden there or commuted through that space knows that it's not the most pleasant place to spend time. But there's a lot of discussion on how to pay for those improvements. And there's also a potential expansion south, a full block. So started under former Governor Cuomo, then taken up by Governor Hochul, is this plan to use value capture financing to build 10 real estate development towers, essentially, on the area around Penn Station. And the revenue generated by those buildings in the form of pilots, payments in lieu of taxes, would then pay off the debt used to renovate and expand the train station. So this has been a proposal. The general project plan was approved this past summer, but there's now this question of, does it make sense to build 10 towers, the bulk of which was meant to be Class A commercial office space, at a time when the future of office space and sort of the value of that is changing, certainly is unknown. And developers are being very wary about taking on these kinds of projects right now. So one of the questions that the hearing posed was, if we don't use this value capture financing plan, what are other ways we could pay for Penn Station? So the first one, New York State could directly just issue debt. This would require a ballot referendum. Now, last year, the state had a referendum for a $4.2 billion environmental bond. This did pass in November. But this is kind of subject to voters' whims, and the state has traditionally tried to shy away from using the ballot referendum, and this is why they largely tend to use authorities like the Empire State Development Corporation, as they sort of have in the original plan. The MTA does a lot of its own funding. There's also the possibility, these are ideas, but how likely they are, we're not saying these are likely to happen at all. But there is a world in which New York City could rezone the neighborhood and have no involvement with the Empire State Development Corporation. And the city itself could enter into agreements with the properties in that area and use the revenues for that rezoned neighborhood to dedicate it to the transit improvements. This is akin to what the city did for Hudson Yards to expand the number 7 train. But if the city were to take on this project, first of all, no mayor or city council has publicly expressed any interest in doing this, in rezoning that neighborhood whatsoever. But if the city were to do this, if they were to take on rezoning and then having pilot agreements to pay for the transit, any gap in timing between new development bringing revenue in and the actual project construction happening, the city would have to cover sort of the financing in that window. Whereas under the value capture plan with Empire State Development, the state's on the hook during that window. And then lastly, always a lively conversation, sitting right on top of Penn Station is Madison Square Garden. And it's easy to talk about Madison Square Garden because they don't pay property taxes. So they have a property tax exemption valued at around $43 million annually. And this has been in place since 1982. And it exists in perpetuity unless the sports teams relocate out of that location or it's repealed by state law. But there's a lot of talk in Albany right now about whether Madison Square Garden should continue to have this benefit. And there's the potential that you could take those property taxes that they're currently not paying and apply them to help finance the project. So that became a very lively discussion, as you can imagine.
And since then, we've been looking at other sports stadiums to understand the structure.
Yes. So largely, Madison Square Garden was built in 1968. It was entirely privately financed. It's built on privately owned land. And in 1982, got this tax exemption. And we were providing some information on how this compares to Yankee Stadium the Barclays Center, and Citi Field. Those are built on public land. They use tax-exempt bond financing, and all three of those stadiums pay pilots. So they don't pay property taxes, but they do make a payment in lieu of property taxes. But those pilots then pay down the debt used to construct the stadium. So there was discussion on, well, other stadiums are making payments, and that was a distinction that was being drawn compared to Madison Square Garden. But there was public involvement in the actual construction of those stadiums as well. And they're all much newer. So Citi Field and Yankee Stadium were opened in 2009, and the Barclays Center, I believe, is 2012. So they're just much newer stadiums, and they were built under a very different sort of model than Madison Square Garden.
Is there no hurdle to having a state statute simply wipe out the tax benefit?
It involves Albany
Yes,
taking it out.
And that's it.
That's it.
There's no covenant with
Nope.
bondholders or anything of that kind that blocks you.
No. Simply repeal that line.
Make it sound so easy.
The other stadiums make pilots for the duration of the bonds. So those have an expiration date. And this was another distinction we drew. Over the 30 or 40 years of that financing, pilots will be made. So those actually have an end date, whereas the way Madison Square Garden's tax exemption was written, it has no end date. And that was a distinction, unless it's repealed.
Very fraught politically.
I mean, it just rides entirely on the politics and the fortune of the particular person who has Madison Square Garden.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes. Maybe he'll just make a voluntary contribution.
Wonder what that does to Rangers tickets.
Any other questions on the Penn Station redevelopment or sports stadiums, etc.? Okay, we're
Emily has something.
Emily, do you have a question?
Take the mouse or something.
Oh, okay. So it's actually just around 9:10, and I think we have time for a little more information. So I asked Sarita if she would present briefly on a budget brief pulled together on school safety.
Yes, so this will be hot off the presses in just about 2 hours, I think. And so you get a little preview. So we have, so Nick on our team, Nick Martin, who is not here, with help from Bernie, who covers NYPD, put together this budget brief that talks about changes to the school safety budget from the DOE perspective over the past year. So since the last preliminary budget last year through this preliminary budget. So school safety agents are civilian employees of the NYPD. The DOE, Department of Education, pays NYPD personnel costs for school safety agents. And they do wear uniforms, but they do not carry guns, and they do work in school buildings full time. So since last preliminary budget through this preliminary budget, there's been a reduction in taken from vacancies from school safety agents of about a quarter. So the number of active school safety agents since pre-pandemic has dropped by from about 5,000 down to below 4,000, so just below 4,000. And largely the reductions have been due to attrition, as well as there was I wouldn't say hiring freeze, but early in the pandemic, there was some restrictions to hiring. And that resulted, we saw just in the period from April 2020 to beginning of 21, a reduction of about 21% of active school safety agents. So a large part of the reduction came early on in the pandemic. And so the largest changes came in the November financial plan with a reduction of 550 vacancies. And then an additional 230 vacancies were taken in this preliminary budget. So this budget brief talks about the history of the there's been a history of over budgeting for this because of these vacancies. And so the past two financial plans largely have taken reductions to the school safety budget to align the budget more closely to expenditures over the past 2 years.
You want to speak briefly to how many school safety agents per school?
Yes, so that's an excellent question that we don't have the answer for. We have been trying to obtain data from the NYPD on the number of school safety agents by school or by building. And we haven't been successful in getting regular reporting of that because we want to be able to track that movement over time. We do know, based on analysis we've done on the city's payroll system, that this position is one of high attrition. And so we know there's a lot of turnover, and they've had some difficulty in hiring like other parts of the city. So yes, that's an excellent question that we are hopeful to try to get some more information about. Because there was a city council local law passed in 2005, I believe, that the NYPD was supposed to produce quarterly reports to the city council on the number of school safety agents by school or school building or campus. And to our knowledge, that has never been complied with. But we have actually requested that data for ourselves on a quarterly basis as well. Thanks, Jen.
Did you ever look at schools that have taken a restorative justice approach to school climate and what investments they have made? Because the few that have been able to move away from the presence of police. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering also if you look at data around school-related incidents and the variation in incidents, calling ERs, citations, arrests in schools with safety agents compared to those with more holistic approaches to climate, mm-hmm. and what you might find.
Yes, that's definitely an interesting question that we've had. We do have data on the list of schools that use restorative justice approaches. We requested more information about restorative justice can be implemented in a very wide range of ways. So that's something from a research perspective that we've struggled with in order to really understand what practices are going on in particular schools. However, it is something that, we do also have data on that the NYPD releases on incidences in schools and who responds to those incidences. So that is something that we have looked at. We haven't married that with the restorative justice data quite yet, but that's something that we're definitely interested
in. I think we could have asked you a general question about the appetite for police safety officers in school. Who's upset about the fact that the number is down, and how and why?
Yeah, it's a good question because that's something we've also been tracking is, there's also been a large increase in the number of social workers in schools during this time when there has been a reduction in school safety agents. One thing we're trying to understand is how, like, the model for placing school safety agents is also something we haven't properly understood. Is there a particular, what metrics are factored into the way that NYPD places school safety agents in schools? Because that's something that's under NYPD control, whereas social workers are more in the wheelhouse of DOE.
Maybe I'm just dated, but this question of who's making the decisions on these personnel in schools, and who do they report to, and how are they incorporated in sort of larger question of school security? I think is a very interesting question, and just the bare numbers of how many of these positions are being funded and filled doesn't really get at the value that is coming out of that in the way it's deployed at the moment.
Yeah, that's stuff like it.
So we agree, and we think that if the 2005 legislation data were to be made available, it would be far easier to understand on a per school basis, at least staffing, which could begin to lead to analysis of why.
Yeah.
Look at student demographics,
Yeah.
population size, and all sorts of other.
And I mean, it's 2005. We're now in 23, and the police department hasn't delivered exactly the nuanced picture that might be contemplated here.
Yeah.
I wonder whether that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, that's why we've tried to request it on our own. On the education team, we were actually thrilled for the possibility back in 2020 of school safety moving over to the Department of Education because it would have allowed us to gain greater access to that data with our MOU with the DOE. But because that didn't happen, it's still a little bit of a black box, although we are really trying to push to get that data.
There are probably more issues connected to that than just the availability of the numerical data to the
So is our ability to get information from the police different than other departments in the city?
Yes, very much so.
Really?
Practically speaking, legally speaking, there is not a difference.
Practically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Practically mean as if their willingness to share information.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, did I hear correctly that the public safety officers are under the under police budget?
Yeah.
Yes.
And police management.
And so our the budget brief that will be issued in a few hours clearly delineates that there is data that would answer the fundamental threshold question, which we would appreciate having shared with us.
There's an entire citywide agenda. There's a multi-group of teen advocates that have been doing citywide surveys for 2 years. And one of the front and center issues is how to get police out of schools. It'd be interesting to connect you guys to part of one group is run out of expertise, for a generational change. You have a group and there are others, but it'd be good for them to share the qualitative information that's emerging from the citywide survey.
Yeah, we've also been interested in getting data on, where there are metal detectors, which is also information that hasn't been released. So.
And that is again determined by the police as opposed to the school.
Correct.
And I think anecdotally, it's important to note that in many schools, school safety agents, in effect, defend the school from people who wish to enter who aren't credibly allowed to. And in other schools, school safety agents are also used to participate with the student body beyond just making sure they're allowed to enter. So there's a strange switch, or there are two functions. And obviously, as a nonpartisan organization, we would simply appreciate having the data to better understand the crisis. Yeah. Any other questions on school safety agents? Shall I do number 6? Sure. So IBO is very pleased to let you all know that we're hiring for a series of positions, and should the advisory board have any recommendations, we have the positions posted in a number of places on our website and other locations, and we'll be happy to share with you the exact titles we're looking for. But we are on the hunt right now. 2, we set schedules for remaining advisory board meetings for the remainder of the year. And we've decided that, as you can see here, it's once a quarter, basically on the 14th, depending on the day of the week, the 14th or the 13th at 8:30, same place, same location. So we thank you in advance for attending those meetings. What is public comments? Or? I'm really bad at this job. So if anyone has public comment, please weigh in. And if not, I will call the meeting to adjourn. Do I need a vote? I don't believe so. I don't think you can adjourn it. You have to vote. A motion to adjourn. All in favor. Someone can second. Wayne.
Second.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe today.